In this video, we'll be covering the essential grammar concepts you need for everyday spoken Brazilian Portuguese. Along with my verb conjugation tutorial, this crash course is designed to be a big picture overview of how the language works in real conversations. Let's start off by talking about nouns and gender agreement, which is one of the most foundational concepts to understand. So all nouns in Portuguese fall under one of two categories, masculine or feminine. When referring to human beings, the classification is straightforward. For example, menino, boy, is masculine, while menina, girl, is feminine. But in other cases, such as with inanimate objects and abstract concepts, it isn't so obvious and may seem quite arbitrary, like livro, book, which is masculine, and comida, food, which is feminine. Most nouns that end in O are generally masculine, while those that end in A are generally feminine. But this isn't always true, and just like almost everything in Portuguese, there are exceptions. Some of these exceptions include dia and mapa, which are both masculine despite ending in A. And then foto and mão are feminine despite ending in O. Some other common masculine noun endings include dor, as in jogador, tor, as in cantor, sor, as in professor, eu, as in museu, el, as in hotel, all, as in futebol, those that end in ma, where there's a similar word in English like problema, as well as those that end in an accented a like sofá. And then other noun endings that are typically feminine include dade, as in cidade, gen, as in viagem, são, where there's a similar English word, as in ação, ie, as in série, zão, as in decisão, tude, as in atitude, idão, as in gratidão, as well as z, as in crise. And once again, you want to think of these more as general patterns rather than strict rules, since there are always exceptions. There are also nouns that can be either masculine or feminine, depending on the gender of the person referred to. These types of nouns will often end in ante, as in estudante, ente, as in cliente, ta, as in dentista, as well as ense, as in canadense. And then some words can be masculine or feminine depending on the meaning. For example, as a masculine noun, the word capital means capital, as in the sense of money or financial assets, while as a feminine noun, capital refers to a capital city. The word cara, as a masculine noun, means guy, while as a feminine noun means face. Ultimately, if you aren't sure whether a certain noun is masculine or feminine, you could always look up the word in a dictionary and it'll give you the gender. In this example, it tells us that the word for action, ação, is a feminine noun. So why is knowing the gender of a noun important? Because articles, adjectives, possessives, and other words linked to the noun have to match its gender. This is what's called gender agreement. But what exactly does this mean in practice? Let's take a look at how a word's gender changes the article that goes with it. For example, the book in Portuguese is o livro, since livro is masculine, while the food is a comida, since comida is feminine. So basically, the way you say the changes depending on whether a noun is masculine or feminine. One of João Gilberto's most famous songs is O Pato, the duck. This tells us that the word for duck, pato, is masculine. This song by Chico Buarque is called A Banda, the band. A is used here because banda is feminine. A noun's gender also affects adjectives. If we wanted to say favorite book, it would be livro favorito. Since livro is masculine, the adjective favorito must also be in its masculine form, as indicated by the O ending. Favorito. Compare that with comida favorita, favorite food. Since comida is feminine, the adjective favorito changes to favorita to match the noun's gender. Possessives, in other words, the way you say my, your, his, her, etc., must also match the noun's gender. For example, my favorite book is meu livro favorito, while my favorite food is minha comida favorita. This video, for example, is titled Minha série favorita, my favorite TV show, with the word série or TV show being a feminine noun. So these were just a few examples to show why knowing a noun's gender is important, and we'll be covering each of these topics in more detail in later sections. Now on to plurals and number agreement. Let's first talk about how to form plurals, and this section applies to both nouns as well as adjectives. So for words ending in vowels, all you do is add an S to the end. For example, livro becomes livros, and casa becomes casas. For those ending in R, Z, or S, you add an ES. So, professor becomes professores, luz becomes luzes, and país becomes países. For words ending in L, the L generally changes to an IS. So, jornal becomes jornais, and hotel becomes hotéis. The title of this blog post is Hotéis Incríveis ao Redor do Mundo. Incredible Hotels Around the World. Notice how not only does the noun hotel become hotéis, but the adjective incrível also changes to incríveis. This is because in Portuguese, when you make a noun plural, any adjective that describes it must also be plural. But words that end in IL and that are stressed on the second to last syllable change to A's. So fácil becomes fáceis, difícil, difíceis, and útil, úteis. Luckily, there are only a few of these that are really common in everyday speech. For those ending in M, the M changes to an NS. So homem becomes homens, and viagem becomes viagens. There's a TV show based on the movie City of God called Cidade dos Homens, known in English as City of Men. Homem, man, homens, men. Now for words ending in ão, you've got three possible endings. The most common is ões. Less common are ães and ãos. So in most cases, words that end in ão will change to ões. For example, decisão becomes decisões, and ação becomes ações. But there are some words that change to ães, like pão, which becomes pães, and alemão, which becomes alemães. And some that change to ãos, such as mão, which becomes mãos, and irmão, which becomes irmãos. And if you aren't sure what a word's plural form is, you can usually find it in the dictionary. Here, it tells us that the plural of the word ação is ações. Now, some nouns have pronunciation changes in the plural, where the closed O sound changes to an open O. An example of this is the word for game, jogo, which becomes jogos in its plural form. Jogo, jogos. Other words that have the same sort of pronunciation change include olho, which becomes olhos, ovo, ovos, and imposto, impostos. Note that I'm using this open O symbol just for learning purposes only, and that's really spelled with a regular O. So in Portuguese, anytime you're referring to a group that includes both males and females, you use the masculine plural form. For example, if you're talking about a group of male students, you would use alunos. If it's an all-female group, it would be alunas. And if it's a mixed gender group, even if there's just one male, it would be alunos. So similar to the concept of gender agreement, articles, adjectives, possessives, and other words linked to a noun must match it in number. In other words, according to whether the noun is singular or plural. For example, if we're talking about one book, we'd say o livro, the book. If we're talking about several books, we'd say os livros, the books. So the way you say the in Portuguese depends on not only whether a noun is masculine or feminine, but also whether it's singular or plural. One of the most popular sitcoms from the early 2000s was Os Normais, the normal ones. Normais being the plural form of normal. As we saw earlier, favorite book is livro favorito. But if we're talking about more than one book, it would be livros favoritos, favorite books. Since the noun livro is in its plural form livros, the adjective favorito must also be in its plural form favoritos to match it. And the same concept applies to possessives. My favorite book, meu livro favorito, singular, while my favorite books, plural, is meus livros favoritos. So this is the basic idea of number agreement, which we'll be constantly coming back to throughout the tutorial. The title of this video is Meus 5 filmes favoritos, my 5 favorite movies. Something unique about the spoken language is that there's a strong tendency to use the singular in a lot of cases where you would use the plural in the written language. You typically see this when making general statements or referring to categories of things. Tem muito brasileiro em Nova York. There are a lot of Brazilians in New York. Eu gosto de maçã. I like apples. Eu adoro filme de ação. I love action movies. Now compare that to formal written context where we'd have to use the plural form. Muitos brasileiros, maçãs, and filmes de ação. Now let's dive a little deeper into the definite articles. How do we say the in Portuguese? As I've briefly touched upon already, the definite article must match the noun in gender, whether it's masculine or feminine, as well as in number, whether it's singular or plural. So once again, the book would be o livro, the books, os livros. The house, a casa, and the houses, as casas. Let's take a look at some more examples. O professor, the teacher. Os professores, the teachers. A cidade, the city. As cidades, the cities. O jornal, the newspaper. Os jornais, the newspapers. A decisão, the decision. As decisões, the decisions. One of the most successful Brazilian sitcoms of all time is A Grande Família, the big family. The definite article a is used since família is feminine. There's a famous samba song called As Rosas Não Falam, the roses don't speak. The word for rose, rosa, being feminine. One thing I want to point out is that in Portuguese, the definite article is used in a lot of cases where you would not use the in English. For example, in many parts of Brazil, especially in the south and southeast, it's common to use the definite article with people's names. So, Paulo is my friend would be O Paulo é meu amigo. I went with Maria. Eu fui com a Maria. It's also used before nouns that are used in a general sense, as in o amor é importante. Love is important. And a água é essencial. Water is essential. The definite articles can also be used with possessives. For example, my book can be translated as meu livro or o meu livro. My house, minha casa, or a minha casa. This is a topic we'll revisit in the section on possessives. You'll also see it used with body parts and clothing, when it's clear who it belongs to. For example, eu lavei as mãos. I washed my hands. And ele tirou o chapéu. He took off his hat. Notice how in English we would use a possessive adjective in these cases, my and his, and not the definite article, the. The definite article is also used with most countries. For example, Brazil is o Brasil. England is a Inglaterra. And Japan is o Japão. One of the few exceptions is Portugal, which is simply Portugal. Also with continents, as in a Europa, a Ásia, and a América. Many states in Brazil also take a definite article, including o Rio de Janeiro, a Bahia, and o Paraná. Some states that don't take an article include São Paulo, Minas Gerais, and Santa Catarina. The definite article is also used with organizations, establishments, media, institutions, public places, and sports teams. But how do we know which article to use, o or a? Generally speaking, it'll depend on the type of thing that it is. For example, if it's a company, especially if it's a big multinational, the default is to use a, as in a Microsoft and a Nike. And it's because the Portuguese word for company, empresa, is feminine. But if a company happens to be a restaurant, you use o because the implied noun, restaurante, is masculine. With streets, you'll generally use a, with apps, o, and then with most Brazilian universities, a, since they tend to be abbreviations of the word universidade, which is feminine. Foreign universities typically don't take an article. So these were just a few examples, and there are always exceptions, but they give you an idea as to the reasoning behind the gender and article used. In this headline, it refers to the company Amazon as a Amazon, since the implied noun empresa is feminine. Now we move on to the indefinite articles. How do we say a book, a house, etc.? The indefinite articles in Portuguese are uns, uma, and umas. So, a book is livro, some or a few books, uns livros. A house, uma casa, some or a few houses, umas casas. The title of this vlog is Uma Semana em Londres comigo. A week in London with me. The fact that uma is used here tells us that the word for week, semana, is feminine. This one says, dia comigo em Nova York. A day with me in New York. Remember that dia is one of the few words that end in a that are masculine, which is why we say dia. Now, the indefinite article is omitted in certain cases where you would use it in English. An example of this is when you're talking about professions. To say, he's a teacher, it would be, ele é professor. The exception to this is when a descriptive adjective is added, like when you say, he's a good teacher. In that case, you would use the indefinite article. As in, ele é bom professor. Since we're adding this adjective bom, or good, to describe what kind of teacher he is, in this case, we would use the indefinite article The indefinite article is also omitted when referring to things in a generic sense. For example, a casa tem piscina. The house has a pool. Since the pool in this case is in reference to a general feature of the house rather than a specific pool, the article uma is not used. Ele não tem carro. He doesn't have a car. Here, we omit the article because we're talking about car ownership in general rather than a specific car. Você já comprou ingresso? Have you bought a ticket yet? Once again, since we're not emphasizing a specific ticket, but rather the purchase in general, we leave out the article. A common use of the plural forms uns and umas is to express approximation, similar to how about or around is used in English. For example, eu tinha uns 20 anos. I was about 20 years old. Eu fiquei umas 2 semanas lá. I spent about 2 weeks there. Let's talk about adjectives and adverbs. So as we saw earlier, adjectives have to agree with the nouns they modify in both gender and number. For example, beautiful book is livro bonito, while beautiful books is livros bonitos. Beautiful house is casa bonita, while beautiful houses is casas bonitas. For most adjectives ending in O, the O changes to an A in its feminine form. So bonito becomes bonita and alto becomes alta. Carro bonito, beautiful car. Casa bonita, beautiful house. For those that end in E, there is no change in the feminine form. So grande remains grande, and so does inteligente. Carro grande, big car. Casa grande, big house. Likewise, for most adjectives that end in a consonant, there is no change. So legal stays the same, as does feliz. Carro legal, cool car. Casa legal, cool house. But those that end in or es will usually add an a to the end, as in trabalhador, trabalhadora, and japonês, japonesa. Carro japonês, Japanese car. Comida japonesa, Japanese food. Which we see in the title of this article. Onde comer comida japonesa em São Paulo? Where to eat Japanese food in São Paulo? Now, some adjectives have pronunciation changes in the feminine singular, where the closed O sound changes to an open O. This is most common in adjectives ending in oso and posto. For example, famoso becomes famosa, gostoso, gostosa, and oposto, oposta. And again, we're just using this open O symbol for learning purposes only. Remember that it's really spelled with a regular O. So, famous book would be livro famoso, while tasty food would be comida gostosa. A few other adjectives that have pronunciation changes in the feminine include novo, nova, and grosso, grossa. Carro novo, new car. Casa nova, new house. These same adjectives also change to an open O in the masculine and feminine plural. So famoso becomes famosa in the feminine singular, but also famosos and famosas in the plural. And the same concept applies to the others. And as we saw earlier, forming the plural of adjectives works in the same way as with nouns. So you can refer back to that section for the general patterns. So as you might have noticed from the example so far, adjectives in Portuguese typically come after the noun, as in uma família francesa, a French family. This is sort of like the default position, which we see here. Costumes de uma família francesa. Customs of a French family. That said, adjectives will sometimes precede the noun in certain cases, like in this example. Excelente vinho francês. An excellent French wine. When the adjective does come before the noun, it's often for emphasis, to express some sort of subjective opinion or figurative quality. Like in uma louca tempestade, a wild storm, where the adjective louca or wild comes before the noun as it conveys a figurative quality. We can see this when we compare the meaning of certain adjectives based on its position. For example, grande homem is a great man, while homem grande is a big man, a man who's physically large. Uma nova casa is a new or different house, while uma casa nova is a house that's literally brand new, one that's just been built. Velho amigo is a friend you've known for a long time, while amigo velho is a friend who's old in age. So you can see how when the adjective comes before the noun, it takes on more of a subjective or figurative quality. And when it comes after the noun, it has more of a literal or objective meaning. I want to briefly touch upon adverbs of manner, which describe how an action is performed. To form them, the basic rule is to add mente to the feminine form of adjectives. So, rápido, fast or quick, becomes rapidamente, quickly. And claro, clear, becomes claramente, clearly. You can see how this mente ending has a similar function to the ly ending in English. For example, ele fala rapidamente. He speaks quickly. That said, in everyday speech, you'll often hear people say, ele fala rápido. He speaks fast, where the masculine adjective form is used directly as an adverb. Now let's learn how to make comparisons in Portuguese. So we have three main types of comparative forms: superiority, inferiority, and equality. Don't worry too much about the terminology. What's really important is that you understand how it works. The first is the comparative of superiority. How do we say that someone or something has more of a certain quality or quantity? The general pattern is mais, which literally means more, plus adjective, adverb, or noun, plus do que. For example, ele é mais novo do que eu. He's younger than me. Or, você tem mais experiência do que eu. You have more experience than me. The opposite of that is the comparative of inferiority, which is formed pretty much the same way, except we use menos, which literally means less. As in, é menos complicado do que parece. It's less complicated than it looks. And eu tenho menos experiência do que ela. I have less experience than her. And then we have the comparative of equality. When we want to say that two things are the same amount of a certain quality, the pattern is tão plus adjective or adverb plus quanto. To say, he's as tall as me, ele é tão alto quanto eu. I'm not as smart as you would be, eu não sou tão inteligente quanto você. Now, to say as much or as many when dealing with nouns, we'd use this pattern. Tanto, tantos, or tanta, tantas, depending on gender and number, plus noun plus quanto. For example, eu não tenho tanta paciência quanto ele. I don't have as much patience as him. Ele não ganha tanto dinheiro quanto antes. He doesn't make as much money as before. To say as much as when dealing with the verb, we'd use this pattern. Verb plus tanto quanto. For example, eu não estudo tanto quanto você. I don't study as much as you. Ele come tanto quanto eu. He eats as much as I do. Besides comparatives, we've also got a few superlative forms, the relative and absolute. The relative superlative expresses the most or least within a group and is formed by the following construction: the definite article plus mais or menos plus adjective plus G. For example, ele é o mais inteligente do grupo. He's the most intelligent in the group. So we use o here because we're referring to a male. Ela é a menos tímida da família. She's the least shy in the family. A is used here because we're talking about a female. Do and da, as we'll see later, are contractions between G and the definite articles. This video is about the oldest restaurant in Florence, o restaurante mais antigo de Florença. Here it says, o café mais famoso da Itália, the most famous cafe in Italy. Remember that most countries in Portuguese take a definite article. In this case, since Italia is feminine, we use the article a Italia. And since G and a contract to form da, we say da Itália. And then here, as estradas mais bonitas da Itália, the most beautiful roads in Italy. Since the word for roads, estradas, is feminine plural, the definite article as well as the adjective bonitas must both reflect that. And then there's the absolute superlative, when you want to emphasize a certain quality to the highest degree, and it's formed by adding issimo to the adjective stem. Adding this ending is like saying really or super before an adjective in English. For example, ele é inteligentíssimo. He's really or super smart. And ela é lindíssima. She's absolutely beautiful, or she's gorgeous. So the issimo ending just intensifies the quality you're describing to the highest degree. Now, some adjectives and adverbs have irregular comparatives, meaning that they have special forms that don't follow the regular pattern of using mais plus adjective for comparisons. Some of the most common ones include melhor, pior, maior, and menor. To make them plural, you just add an es to the end. Melhores, piores, maiores, and menores. And even though they do agree in number, they do not in gender, so no separate forms for feminine nouns. So for example, on the left, it says, o melhor lugar de Verona, the best place in Verona. And then on the right, a melhor cidade, the best city. Even though lugar is masculine and cidade is feminine, we use melhor in both cases regardless of gender. Here's another one. Pior estrada, worst road. And melhor jantar, best dinner. You use pior regardless of the fact that estrada is feminine. The name of this travel channel is Melhores Destinos, best destinations. Since destinos is plural, melhor changes to melhores to reflect that. If we want to make proportional comparisons in Portuguese, similar to how we say the more, or the less in English, we'd use quanto mais, or quanto menos, menos. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Quanto mais você estuda, mais você aprende. The more you study, the more you learn. Or, quanto menos você lê, menos você aprende. The less you read, the less you learn. We can also make progressive comparisons, which convey a sense of gradual increase or decrease, kind of like how more and less are used in English. And the phrases we use are cada vez mais or cada vez menos. Está ficando cada vez mais difícil. It's getting more and more difficult. Now, in informal English, we might just say it's getting harder and harder, but it basically conveys the same idea. Eu estou ganhando cada vez menos dinheiro. I'm making less and less money. Let's talk about subject pronouns in Brazilian Portuguese. How do you say I, you, he, she, etc.? Let's first take a look at the subject pronouns that you'll be using most in everyday conversations. I is eu, you is você, he, ele, she, ela, we, a gente, which is the colloquial form. They can be eles or elas when referring strictly to a group of females. And you guys is vocês. A few other ones you'll want to be familiar with are tu, which is an informal form of address that's most common in the north, northeast, and south of Brazil. There are also the polite forms o senhor, which is used with a man, and a senhora, which is used with a woman. These are typically used when talking to people much older than you, as well as in customer service contexts. And then there's nós, which is the standard form of saying we. This is used more in formal contexts, while a gente tends to be more common in everyday speech. So if we summarize these pronouns based on how they're conjugated, we basically have 4 different groups. Using the verb falar, which means to speak, as an example, in the present tense, you have falo, fala, falamos, and falam. Tu technically has its own set of conjugations, but in Brazil, it's almost always conjugated in the third person singular. Now, the subject pronouns are often omitted when the verb conjugation or context makes it clear who the subject is. So, eu sou americano, I'm American, becomes sou americano. And nós moramos no Rio, we live in Rio, becomes moramos no Rio. You'll hear people using it both ways, with and without the pronoun, with no difference in meaning. How do we translate it as a subject of a sentence? Well, generally speaking, we don't translate it at all. To say it's important, for example, it would be é importante without any pronoun. And then it's raining would be está chovendo. Now on to the direct object pronouns, which describe who is receiving the action directly. This is best illustrated with sample sentences. Ele me viu. He saw me. And ela me ajudou. She helped me. Notice how the me comes before the verb. In the spoken language, to say he saw you, we have 2 options that are both very common. It could be ele te viu or ele viu você. She helped you, ela te ajudou, or ela ajudou você. Notice how when you use te, it becomes before the verb, and when you use você, it comes after. So, I love you can be translated as both eu te amo or eu amo você, as you can see in the names of these 2 songs. To say I saw him in standard textbook Portuguese, it would be eu o vi. But what you're much more likely to hear in an actual conversation is eu vi ele. I helped her, eu a ajudei. Or eu ajudei ela in everyday speech. Again, notice the difference in position between the 2. He saw us would be ele nos viu, or ele viu a gente in casual speech. She helped us could be ela nos ajudou, or ela ajudou a gente. You'll hear both these forms widely used in everyday conversation. To say I saw them, eu os vi in more formal Portuguese, or eu vi eles in informal speech. I helped them, feminine, eu as ajudei, or eu ajudei elas. I saw you guys would be eu os vi in very formal written context, or eu vi vocês in everyday conversation. I helped you guys, feminine. Eu as ajudei, or eu ajudei vocês. So this chart summarizes just the direct object pronouns that are most common in everyday spoken contexts, and their position in relation to the verb. Notice how the ones that come after the verb are the same as the subject pronouns. This is not how you'll see direct object pronouns taught in traditional Portuguese textbooks or what you'll see in formal writing. But it does reflect how people actually speak, which is the whole point of this tutorial. And just as when it is used as a subject pronoun, as an object pronoun, it usually goes untranslated in the spoken language, being understood from context. For example, to say, I saw it, you could say, eu vi, literally, I saw. To say, I heard it, eu ouvi. In both cases, the it is implied. That said, you will hear people using ele and ela to specify it for clarity or emphasis. For example, eu comprei a casa. I bought the house becomes eu comprei ela. I bought it. In this case, we use ela since casa is feminine. And then with a masculine noun like livro, you'd use ele, as in eu comprei ele. Again, these are only used in informal speech. And then we have the indirect object pronouns, which describes the person who receives something. For example, he gave me a gift would be ele me deu presente. Once again, notice how the me comes before the verb. So the indirect object pronoun answers the question, who did he give the gift to? He gave it to me. Another way of saying this is, ele deu presente para mim. Literally, he gave a present to me. Now, in the spoken language, the para is often pronounced as pra mim. She sent me a link. Ela me mandou link. Or, ela mandou link pra mim. So both ways are common in everyday speech, but the first one is the standard form. To say he gave you a gift, ele te deu presente. Or, ele deu presente pra você. She sent you a link. Ela te mandou link. Or, ela mandou link para você. Both forms are used in conversation. I gave him a gift in standard textbook Portuguese would be eu lhe dei presente. Now, you really only see this in formal written contexts. There are some small pockets in the northeast of Brazil where lhe is still used in the spoken language, but in most of the country, what you'll hear is eu dei presente pra ele. I sent her a link. Eu lhe mandei link. Standard, or eu mandei link pra ela. Spoken. He gave us a gift. Ele nos deu presente. Or, ele deu presente pra gente. She sent us a link. Ela nos mandou link. Or, ela mandou link pra gente. I gave them a gift. Eu lhes dei presente. Informal written context, or eu dei presente pra eles in informal speech. I sent them a link. Eu lhes mandei link, or eu mandei link para elas. Likewise, with you guys, I gave you guys a gift. Eu lhes dei presente in formal writing, or eu dei presente para vocês, colloquially. I sent you guys a link. Eu lhes mandei link, or eu mandei link para vocês. And here is a summary of just the indirect object pronouns you'll be using most in everyday conversation. The ones that come after the verb are basically just the subject pronouns preceded by para. The one exception is para mim or pra mim. And we'll see in the next section why this is the case. In this next section, we'll be discussing prepositions, those connecting words that show relationships between things. Some of the most common prepositions include de, em, para, por, a, com, and sem. Let's take a look at some common uses for de, which is one of the most important prepositions in Portuguese. One way that it's used is in situations where you would say of in English, as in copo de água, glass of water, as well as from. Ele é de São Paulo. He is from São Paulo. It's also used to indicate possession, as in o livro do Paulo, Paulo's book, to convey some sort of attribute or characteristic, as in mesa de madeira, which is a table made of wood or wooden table. As part of some time expressions, as in de manhã, in the morning. It can also mean by when talking about means of transport, as in eu fui de metrô, I went by subway. To describe a person's appearance, as in o cara de bigode, the guy with the mustache, or the way that they're dressed, as in a menina de preto, the girl in black. We saw earlier how it's used with superlatives, as in o melhor do mundo, the best in the world. De is also used after certain verbs like gostar, as in gostar de música, to like music, and lembrar, lembrar de alguém, to remember someone. There's a classic bossa nova song called Águas de Março, Waters of March. One thing to note is that G contracts with the definite articles. So what exactly does this mean? Let's take this phrase in English as an example. The author of the book, and translate it into Portuguese. So the author is o autor. Of is G, and the book is o livro. But in Portuguese, anytime the words G and U come together like this, they contract to form this new word, do. So we say, o autor do livro. This is a mandatory contraction, meaning we can't say o autor de o livro. We have to say do livro. That's the basic idea of contractions, two words merging together to form another one. Besides do, the other contractions are dos, da, and das. You see das in the title of the song Caminho das Águas, Path of the Waters, by Maria Rita, and do in Luz do Sol, literally light of the sun or sunlight, by Caetano Veloso. G also contracts with ele and eles to form dele and deles, as well as with ela to form dela and delas. I like him would be eu gosto dele. You'll notice that dela is pronounced with an open E. Dela. Note that the open E symbol is used here for learning purposes only and that it's really spelled with a regular E. Then there's por, which is used in a ton of different ways. It's used to indicate a reason or cause, as in, eu aprendi por necessidade. I learned it out of necessity. A means of doing something. Eu mandei por e-mail. I sent it by email. Duration. Eu estudei por 2 horas. I studied for 2 hours. An exchange. Eu vendi por 50 reais. I sold it for 50 reais. Some sort of rate or frequency, as in 3 vezes por semana, 3 times a week. It can also mean through or around when indicating location or movement. Eu andei por toda a cidade. I walked around the entire city. It's also used in passive voice constructions, as in foi escrito por ele. It was written by him. Just as with G, por contracts with the definite articles to form pelo, pela, pelos, and pelas. We see pela used here. Quanto custa viajar pela Europa em 2025? How much does it cost to travel around Europe in 2025? Remember that continents take the definite article. Our next preposition is em, which can be translated as in when referring to a location, as in eu moro em São Paulo. I live in São Paulo. Sometimes it can translate as at, as in ele está em casa. He's at home. And other times we'd use it where we'd say on in English. O livro está na mesa. The book is on the table. As we'll see in a bit, na is a contraction of em and the definite article a. Em is also used in time references like days, months, and years. Eu fui lá em janeiro. I went there in January. In everyday speech, it can also convey movement towards a destination, as in eu fui no mercado. I went to the market. This is only used in colloquial Brazilian Portuguese and usually implies a quick visit to a place. Em also contracts with the definite articles to form nu, na, nos, and nas. An example of this is na estrada, on the road, by Marisa Monte. There's also pé na areia, foot in the sand, by Diogo Nogueira. Now, there are also contractions between em and the indefinite articles. These are optional contractions, but they are very common in the spoken language. And they are num, numa, nuns, numas. For example, eu cresci numa cidade pequena. I grew up in a small town. Eu moro num apartamento. I live in an apartment. Em also contracts with ele and eles to form nele and neles, as well as with ela to form nela and nelas, as in eu pensei nela, I thought about her. The next one is para, which in everyday speech is usually pronounced as pra. It can be used to convey a sense of purpose, as in, eu vim para aprender. I came to learn. It's also used to indicate movement toward a destination. Ele foi para Salvador. He went to Salvador. Now, the difference between em and para in this sense is that para usually implies a longer stay at the destination. Another use case for para is to indicate the recipient of something. É presente para você. It's a gift for you. This video title shows how para is used to express purpose. Melhores séries para aprender inglês na Netflix. Best shows to learn or for learning English on Netflix. Para can also contract with the definite articles to form pro, pra, prus, and pras. These contractions are only used in an informal speech. For example, I went to the US would be eu fui pros Estados Unidos. Now, as we'll see later, in the standard written language, you would use the preposition a in this context, which contracts to aos. Eu fui aos Estados Unidos. This is how most Portuguese courses will teach you to say it, but in everyday speech, what you'll usually hear is eu fui pros Estados Unidos. That leads us to our next preposition, a. This one is used much more in formal contexts rather than informal, but we'll still take a look at a few common uses. So, a is used in expressions of distance like moro a uma quadra da praia. I live a block from the beach. In this case, there is no English equivalent. It's also used in time expressions. A aula começa ao meio-dia. The class starts at noon. Ao being a contraction with the definite article u. In more formal and written contexts, a also indicates movement towards a destination, as in eu fui ao mercado and eu fui aos Estados Unidos. But as we saw earlier, in the spoken language, what you'll hear is eu fui no mercado and eu fui pros Estados Unidos. So a contracts with the definite articles to form ao, a, aos, and as. You'll also see prepositions in a lot of fixed expressions, often used in ways that can't be translated literally. A few examples include de graça, which means free, em vez de, instead of, and por isso, that's why. Now, I want to point out a few special pronoun forms that are used after a preposition. So, as you can see highlighted in red, after a preposition, we have to use mim and not eu when it's just used as an object. Everything else stays the same. Specifically after the preposition com, we have a couple of special forms. Comigo, with me, and conosco, with us. But conosco is used more in formal contexts. In everyday conversation, it's much more common to say com a gente. And in parts of Brazil where tu is used, we have a few special forms as well. It's chi after most prepositions, and after com, it would be contigo. Let's look at a few examples of prepositional pronouns. Vem comigo. Come with me. Esse livro é para mim. This book is for me. Eles foram sem mim. They went without me. Ela falou bem de você. She spoke well of you. This vlog is titled Uma Semana Comigo em Tóquio, Japão. A week with me in Tokyo, Japan. Now on to possessives. How do we say my, mine, your, yours, his, her, etc.? So possessives agree in both gender and number with the possessed object. For example, my book is meu livro, while my books is meus livros. My house is minha casa, while my houses is minhas casas. The title of this song, Minha Voz, Minha Vida, tells us that the words voz, which means voice, and vida, which means life, are both feminine. Let's first take a look at the possessive forms in standard textbook Portuguese, which are used in formal contexts. When referring to masculine objects, you have meu, seu, and nosso in the singular, and in the plural, you just add an S to the end. Meus, seus, nossos. And with feminine objects, you've got minha, sua, and nossa. Now, as you can imagine, seu and sua can create some confusion given that they can refer to so many different people. It could mean your, his, her, as well as their. And so in the spoken language, in order to avoid ambiguity, the forms highlighted in yellow are used to help us specify who exactly we're referring to. Let's take a look at a few examples to show how these are used. To say her car would be o carro dela, where dela, as we saw in the preposition section, is a contraction of G and ela. So literally, you're saying the car of her. Our next one is a casa dele, his house, where dele is a contraction of G and ele, literally the house of him. Their car would be o carro deles, the car of them. Then a casa de vocês is your house when you're addressing more than one person. Now, besides seu and sua to mean your, you'll also hear some people say teu and tua. And then another way of saying our is da gente, which is more informal than saying nosso or nossa. Here it says nossa casa em Verona, our house in Verona. Something to note is that possessives can be preceded by the definite article when used before a noun. This is optional, but you do tend to hear it more in the south and southeast of Brazil. For example, you might hear someone referring to their dad as either meu pai or o meu pai, literally the my dad, and their mom as minha mãe or a minha mãe, with no difference in meaning. Here we see the definite article a used with the possessive sua. Dicas para a sua viagem. Tips for your trip. The a in this case being optional. That said, after prepositions that contract with the definite article, it's usually included in the spoken language. For example, my dad's car would be o carro do meu pai. In more formal written context, the article is usually left out, as in o carro de meu pai. And then in our city would be na nossa cidade. In more formal writing, this would be em nossa cidade. One of the songs that João Gilberto made famous was Samba da Minha Terra, Samba from my homeland. Now, when the possessives are used as pronouns, in other words, when they're standing alone in place of a noun, they're normally preceded by the definite article, except after the verb ser. For example, your kids are younger than mine would be seus filhos são mais novos do que os meus. So here we include the article os, which refers to filhos or kids, which is masculine plural. But after the verb ser, as in essa bicicleta é minha, the bike is mine, we omit the article. So the Portuguese equivalent of the English apostrophe S to express possession is do or da plus the person. For example, Maria's car would be o carro da Maria. We use da since Maria is female. Also recall that with people's names, it's common to use the definite article. Paulo's house would be a casa do Paulo. Marco's kids, os filhos do Marco. Again, in formal written contexts, as well as in some parts of Brazil, it would be just G without the article. Now, when possessives are placed after the noun, it corresponds to the English of mine, of yours, of ours, etc. As in, amigo meu, a friend of mine, and uma amiga nossa, a friend of ours. So when context makes it clear who it belongs to, the definite article, rather than the possessive, is often used. And you typically see this when talking about body parts, clothing, and personal accessories. As in, eu lavei as mãos. I washed my hands. Literally, I washed the hands. And ela tirou o casaco. She took off her jacket. Literally, the jacket. Next is demonstratives. How do we say this, that, these, those? Now, in standard Portuguese, the way you say this when you're referring to someone or something near you is este when masculine, as in este livro, this book, and esta when feminine, as in esta casa, this house. To say that when talking about someone or something near the person you're talking to, you use esse livro, and essa casa. When it's far from both of you, you use aquele livro, which is like saying that book over there, and aquela casa. That said, in the spoken language, there's a strong tendency to avoid este and esta, such that in everyday conversation, esse and essa can be used to mean both this and that. As in, eu quero essa luta. I want that fight. And then to make them plural and say these or those, you would just add an S to the end. Esses, essas, aqueles, aquelas. So, esse livro é muito bom can mean both this book as well as that book is really good. Then, aquela menina é minha amiga is like saying that girl over there is my friend. There are also what are called neuter demonstrative pronouns. which are used when we're not referring to a specific noun with a gender. For example, with abstract ideas, situations, previously mentioned information, and unspecified objects. In Standard Portuguese, we have isto, isso, and aquilo. But isto is really only used in formal written contexts. So in the spoken language, we've got isso, meaning this or that, and aquilo, which means that, but has a more distant quality. For example, isso é importante. This, that is important. Aquilo foi incrível. That was incredible. So in these two cases, since we're not clearly referring to a specific noun with a gender, we use the neuter forms isso and aquilo. Here's another example with isso. Isso vai mudar sua vida em 6 meses. This will change your life in 6 months. So the preposition em contracts with the demonstratives to form nesse, nessa, nisso, naquele, naquela, naquilo. So just like all the other contractions with em, we add an n before. For example, eu moro nessa casa. I live in this house. They also contract with G by adding a D before, as in, qual é o nome desse lugar? What's the name of this place? Now let's go over how we'd say here and there in Portuguese. They basically follow a similar logic as the demonstratives. So here is aqui, there is aí, when you're referring to a location near the person you're talking to. Ali refers to a place that's far from both, but within sight, kind of like over there. And then lá refers to a place that's further away and out of sight. Eu moro aqui. I live here. Let's say you're talking to someone online who's in a different time zone. You might ask, que horas são aí? What time is it there? Aí referring to their location. Vamos sentar ali. Let's sit over there. Let's say you're in Brazil and the person you're talking to mentions that they once lived in Paris. If you wanted to say, I live there too, it would be, eu morei lá também. And the ones that start with A also contract with G. Daqui, daí, dali. Vamos sair daqui às 8. Let's leave from here at 8. Now let's go over the relative pronouns. So first off, what are relative pronouns? At their core, they're basically just words that connect ideas and help avoid repetition. So, for example, in English, instead of saying, I have a friend, my friend lives in Brazil, we can say, I have a friend who lives in Brazil, where the relative pronoun who allows us to connect two sentences about the same person or thing. Let's take a look at another example. This is the book. I bought the book. This is the book that I bought, where the word that functions kind of like the glue that helps us combine these two thoughts into one phrase. So that's the basic idea of relative pronouns. By far, the most common relative pronoun in Portuguese is que, also pronounced que, which can be translated as that, who, or which. For example, eu tenho amigo. I have a friend. Meu amigo mora no Brasil. My friend lives in Brazil. Combining the two, we get Eu tenho amigo que mora no Brasil. I have a friend who lives in Brazil. Our other example in Portuguese would be Esse é o livro. This is the book. Eu comprei o livro. I bought the book. Putting them together, esse é o livro que eu comprei. This is the book that I bought. Now, unlike in English, the relative pronoun can never be omitted in Portuguese. In English, for example, instead of saying, this is the book that I bought, we'll often drop the that and say, this is the book I bought. But in Portuguese, we can never omit the relative pronoun. So we'd always have to say, esse é o livro que eu comprei. Our next relative pronoun is onde, which refers to places, and its use is pretty straightforward. So rather than saying, esse é o lugar, this is the place. Eu trabalho nesse lugar. I work at this place. We can say, esse é o lugar onde eu trabalho. This is the place where I work. There's also quem, which refers exclusively to people, and it's usually followed by a preposition. For instance, eu trabalho com cara. I work with a guy. O cara é brasileiro. The guy is Brazilian. O cara com quem eu trabalho é brasileiro. The guy who I work with is Brazilian. So in Portuguese, when we use quem, the word order is the same as how we'd express this in formal written English. The guy with whom I work is Brazilian, where the preposition comes before the relative pronoun. So que, onde, and quem are by far the ones you'll be using most in everyday speech. Now, in Portuguese textbooks, you'll also see o qual and cujo, but these are really only used in formal written contexts. In conversation, you would use que or quem instead. Now we're going to learn how to ask questions. We'll start by covering the main question words that are typically followed by verbs. The first one is o que, what. O que você faz? What do you do? Como, how. Como você aprendeu? How did you learn? Quando, when. Quando você chegou? When did you arrive? Onde? Onde ele mora? Where does he live? Quem? Who? Quem ligou? Who called? Por quê? Why? Por que você saiu? Why did you leave? Pra quê? What for? Pra que você precisa disso? What do you need this for? Quanto? How much? Quanto você pagou? How much did you pay? You can also see quanto being used here. Quanto gastei? Mês na Europa. How much I spent? 1 month in Europe. And then we have those that are generally followed by nouns, as in que or what. Que filme você quer assistir? What movie do you want to watch? The next one is quanto or quanta, depending on the noun's gender. How much? Quanto dinheiro você tem? How much money do you have? Or quantos or quantas? how many of something. Quantas irmãs você tem? How many sisters do you have? Then there's qual or quais, which mean which. Qual livro você leu? Which book did you read? The plural form of qual is quais. Quais livros você leu? Which books did you read? So when you use qual or quais, you're asking someone to choose or identify from a range of possibilities. As in, qual é a melhor equipe? Which is the better team? One thing to note is that qual and quais are used in certain questions where what would be used in English. For example, when asking for someone's name, qual é seu nome? What's your name? Now, in the spoken language, the é in qual é is often omitted. So it would just be qual seu nome or qual o seu nome with the definite article. Qual is also used when talking about professions. Qual sua profissão? What's your job? Or qual a sua profissão with the definite article. It's used to ask about favorites. Qual seu filme favorito? What's your favorite movie? As well as contact info. Qual seu número de telefone? What's your phone number? Now, an informal way of asking where is or where are is cadê? For example, cadê meu celular? Where's my phone? Or cadê seus amigos? Where are your friends? So you see it stays the same even in the plural. And it often conveys a sense of surprise, like when you're expecting someone or something to be there, but they're not. Let's talk a little bit about preposition placement in questions. So in English, we'll say things like, who are you going with? Where are you going to? Where are you from? Where the prepositions with, to, and from just kind of dangle at the end of the question. Now let's see how we'd say the same thing in Portuguese. Com quem você vai? Literally, with whom are you going? So it's similar to the word order of formal written English. Para onde você vai? De onde você é? So in Portuguese, the preposition has to go before the question word. So what we just saw is the standard textbook way of asking questions. Now, in the spoken language, it's really common to place the interrogative expression after the verb, as in, você vai com quem? Literally, you're going with who? And você é de onde? Literally, you're from where? I like to call this the flip, since you're just flipping the order of the words. So in the spoken language, the phrase é que, which literally translates to is it that, is often added after a question word. For example, instead of the standard o que você faz to ask someone what they do, adding the é que, it becomes o que é que você faz? Literally, what is it that you do? Rather than saying por que você saiu to ask why someone left, it becomes por que é que você saiu? Literally, why is it that you left? Now, in practice, the é very often gets dropped in everyday speech. So what you'll actually hear people say is o que você faz? Or por que você saiu? And this pretty much applies to all of the question words we've gone over. So forming yes-no questions in Portuguese is really simple. Let's take the statement, ele é brasileiro, as an example. He's Brazilian. Now, to turn this into a question, all we do is raise our intonation at the end. Ele é brasileiro? Is he Brazilian? Now, to respond affirmatively to a yes-no question in Portuguese, it's most common to repeat the verb in the question instead of just saying sim. For example, if someone asks you, você vai? Are you going? You'd respond by simply saying vou or vou sim. If you ask someone if they speak English, você fala inglês? They'd reply falo or falo sim. Literally, I speak, yes. That's not to say you'll never hear people responding with just a simple sim, but this is the most common way. Now, if a question contains the word já, which can be translated as already, yet, or ever, já is used to give an affirmative answer. So if someone asks you if you've eaten yet, você já comeu? You just say já. Ele já foi? Did he already go? Já. Yes. How do we form tag questions, which are those short phrases added to the end of a statement to seek confirmation about something? In Portuguese, the most common one is não é, which often gets shortened to né. For example, ele é brasileiro, não é? Which is like saying he's Brazilian, isn't he? Or he's Brazilian, right? Or he's Brazilian, huh? And then in everyday speech, this usually becomes né, as in ele é brasileiro, né? Now let's talk about indefinite adjectives and pronouns. These are those words we use when we're not talking about a specific person, thing, or number. For example, in English, we'll say things like someone, something, anyone, everything, etc. So the indefinite words that we use to refer specifically to people include alguém, which means someone, as in alguém me ligou, someone called me. And then there's ninguém, no one. Ninguém sabe por quê, no one knows why, which is used here. Los Angeles, o que ninguém te conta. Los Angeles, what no one tells you. Those that refer to things include alguma coisa, something. Você quer comer alguma coisa? Do you want to eat something? Another slightly more formal way of saying this is algo. Nada, nothing. Nada me surpreende. Nothing surprises me. Tudo, everything. Tudo mudou. Everything changed. Here it says tudo sobre números em inglês. Everything about numbers in English. And then there are those that could refer to both people and things, such as algum, some, any. And this will need to agree in gender and number, which is what these slashes mean. So it could be either algum, alguma, alguns, or algumas. For example, eu vi algumas pessoas. I saw some people. Nenhum. No, none. Nenhum aluno faltou. No student was absent. Muito. A lot of. Very. Eu tenho muito trabalho. I have a lot of work. Pouco. Few. Little. Eu tenho poucas opções. I have few options. Todo, all, every. Tenho aula toda semana. I have class every week. The title of this video is Palavras que poucos brasileiros sabem em inglês. Words that few Brazilians know in English. Tanto, so much, many. Ele tem tanto talento. He has so much talent. Vários, várias. Several. Eu tenho vários livros. I have several books. Outro, another, other. Quer outra cerveja? Do you want another beer? So the next two are invariable, meaning that they stay the same regardless of gender and number. Cada, each. Cada aluno recebeu livro. Each student received a book. Qualquer, any, whatever. Você pode escolher qualquer prato. You can choose any dish. So there are a few things to note about todo. When it's used with a singular noun, it means every, as in todo homem, every man, and toda mulher, every woman. If we add in the definite article, it means the whole or entire. Todo o país, the whole country. Toda a cidade, the whole city. Now, the todo can also come after the noun with the same meaning, as in o país todo and a cidade toda. When it's used with a definite article and plural nouns, it means all or all the, as in todos os homens, all men, and todas as mulheres, all women. In this section, we'll be discussing negation in Portuguese. So a negation in Portuguese is pretty straightforward compared to English. To make a sentence negative, we just add não before the verb. For example, eu falo inglês. I speak English. Eu não falo inglês. I don't speak English. Ela foi. She went. Ela não foi. She didn't go. Eu posso ir. I can go. Eu não posso ir. I can't go. Here it says, o que não levar para a Europa. What not to bring to Europe. To say never, it would be nunca. Eu nunca como peixe. I never eat fish. Another one is ainda não. Not yet. Eu ainda não vi o filme. I haven't seen the movie yet. Também não. Not either. Eu também não gosto. I don't like it either. Not anymore would be não mais. Ele não mora mais no Brasil. He doesn't live in Brazil anymore. This one says, não quero mais jiu-jitsu na minha vida. I don't want jiu-jitsu in my life anymore. Ninguém, no one. Eu não vi ninguém. I didn't see anyone. So you can see how, unlike in English, here we have a double negative, não and ninguém, which is the norm in Portuguese, which we see again here with nada, nothing. Eu não vi nada. I didn't see anything. Nenhum, no, none. Não tenho nenhum livro. I don't have any books. Notice how the negated noun livro is singular, whereas in English it's plural. Books. Nem, not even. Eu nem te vi. I didn't even see you. Nem, neither, nor. Nem ele, nem ela sabem. Neither he nor she know. Just a note on double negatives. When a negative word follows the verb must be preceded by não or another negative. For example, eu não fiz nada. I didn't do anything. Ele nunca fala nada. He never says anything. Now, in casual speech, it's common to add a não after the verb, and it's usually for emphasis or to convey a sense of doubt, as in não vou não, I'm not going, or não sei não, I don't know. Now let's talk about diminutives and augmentatives. First, the diminutives, which are word forms that can express smallness, endearment, informality, or pejorative connotations. In English, we'll add certain word endings to do this, like mommy, Johnny, or piglet. In Portuguese, the most common way of forming the diminutive is with the word endings inho, masculine, and inha, feminine, as in Brazilian soccer legend Ronaldinho, which is the diminutive of the name Ronaldo. Another example is casinha, little house, which comes from casa. Another example is this song by Maria Rita, Menininha do Portão, little girl by the gate. Menininha being the diminutive of menina. But there are words that form their diminutive by adding zinho or zinha to the end. They tend to be ones that end in stressed vowels or certain consonants like L, M, or R, as in cafezinho, small coffee, and florzinha, little flower. One of Caetano Veloso's most famous songs is O Leãozinho, the little lion. Leãozinho from leão. The thumbnail here says, Nossa cidadezinha nas Dolomitas. Our town in the Dolomites. Cidadezinha being the diminutive form of cidade, which is a feminine noun. So besides conveying a sense of smallness, as in mesinha, little table, and affection, as in Paulinho, the diminutive in Portuguese can also be used as a way of saying very or really. For example, whereas perto means close, pertinho means really close. It can also express that something is just the right amount or degree, not too much and not too little. So whereas quente just means warm, quentinho is like saying nice and warm. It's just the perfect temperature. Now, depending on the context, the diminutive can also have a pejorative connotation. You'll often hear people referring to politicians or políticos as politicozinhos. And just adding that zinho ending gives the word a belittling, dismissive tone. Besides the diminutives, we also have augmentatives, which are word forms that can express largeness, intensity, appreciation, or pejorative connotations. The most common augmentative word endings are masculine, and ona, feminine, as in bonitão, really handsome, and mesona, big table. For a lot of words that end in stressed vowels or certain consonants, you add zão or zona to the end, as in pezão, Bigfoot, and mãezona, great mother. You'll also see the endings aço and assa, as in golaço, which you'll hear a lot in the context of soccer to describe an amazing goal, and amigaça, a great friend. Besides expressing largeness, as in peixão, big fish, and intensity, as in cheirão, strong smell, augmentatives can also convey a sense of appreciation, like amigão, a good friend or buddy. And like diminutives, they can also have a negative connotation. So whereas sujeira is a mess, sujeirona is a huge or filthy mess. In this video, the girl talks about how she learned English fast. Como eu aprendi inglês rapidão. How I learned English super fast. So whereas rápido means fast, rapidão is like saying super fast. In the following section, we'll be discussing reflexive verbs. So what exactly are reflexive verbs? At a super basic level, they're verbs where the person doing the action is also receiving it. In English, we'll often, but not always, indicate this with the suffix self. For example, she dressed herself and he blamed himself. Now, as we'll see a little bit later, there's more to it than just this, but this is a helpful starting point to understanding how reflexives work. So in Portuguese, reflexive verbs are marked with reflexive pronouns me, si, or nos, depending on the subject, which in the spoken language generally appear before the verb. For example, eu não me vejo fazendo isso. I don't see myself doing that. Ele se olhou no espelho. He looked at himself in the mirror. Nós nos expressamos através da arte. We express ourselves through art. Let's look at some of the most common uses of reflexive verbs in everyday speech. The first use, as we just saw, indicates actions done to yourself, as in eu me vesti, I got dressed. Another common use is with reciprocal actions. In English, we'll often express this with the phrase each other, as in they hugged each other. In Portuguese, this would be eles se abraçaram. Reflexive verbs are also used to express personal emotion or reaction. For example, a gente se divertiu. We had fun. And then there are verbs that don't fit in any of these categories and are just inherently reflexive. An example of this is with the verb gabar-se, to brag, as in ele se gaba muito. He brags a lot. So if you look up a verb in the dictionary and you see this dash "c" ending, you'll know that the verb is used reflexively. Here, it tells us that the verb divertir-se, which means to have fun, is reflexive. Here, it says minha cidade na Toscana, my city in Tuscany. Me arrependo de morar aqui. Do I regret living here? So, me arrependo is the present tense of the reflexive verb arrepender-se, to regret, which is always followed by the preposition de when specifying what it is you regret. Now, in the spoken language, there's a strong tendency to avoid reflexive pronouns with a lot of verbs that are normally reflexive in standard written Portuguese. For example, ele se esqueceu. he forgot often becomes ele esqueceu in everyday speech. Eu vou me sentar aqui. I'm going to sit here becomes eu vou sentar aqui. And that's the end of the tutorial.